And I'd like to mention that we will have the slide set and the recording available on the Odot certification webpage, probably within a couple days after this meeting. So if you need access that slide set for references or anything like that, you can do that. We're going to have a pretty big group today. We've got about 118 people registered, and we're welcoming 3 people from the state of Idaho.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Now, what part of Idaho did you say, Kip?
We're in Boise.
Boise.
Yeah, on the western side.
All right, I still hear people dinging in, so we'll give it a little bit more time and then we'll get started.
Looking at the numbers, it looks like we're expecting maybe up to 30 people. So I think everything's just kind of rolling in.
So we'll just go over, you can see the tech tips on the video. I think most folks are familiar with Zoom at this point. Your controls are if you hover over the bottom of your screen, and if to change from gallery view to speaker view, go up to the top right. If you're having bandwidth issues, you might try turning off your video. Otherwise, we do like to see the faces. If you're on a phone, please select either your phone or your computer. Both are up, otherwise it echoes. And if you can mute your audio until you speak, that would be great if everyone can do that now, except for our guest speakers, of course. And if you have any questions, put a note in the chat or raise your hand and we will get to you the best that we can.
Right. What do you think, Charlene? Do we want to go ahead and get started?
All right, I think so.
Okay. All right. Welcome to the ADA and Tpar for Certified Local Public Agencies. This workshop is presented by the CUG Process Improvement and Training Subcommittee. We have some great guest speakers with us today that are going to be presenting a lot of good information. As I mentioned earlier, we are recording this session and we will have the recording and the slide set available for you on Odot's certification webpage later. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to our 2 very hardworking hosts, Hannah Eastwood from Odot and Jordan Vesper from City of Eugene, to kick us off.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Jordan Vesper. I'm one of the co-leads for the newly merged Process Improvement and Training Subcommittee. And I just want to welcome everyone and thank you for taking time out of your day to join us for this training. To get the training kicked off, let me introduce Hannah Eastwood. Hannah, take it away.
Thanks, Jordan. So along with Jordan, I am the co-chair of the Certification User Group Process Improvement and Training Subcommittee. So if you ever have any training suggestions or process improvement suggestions, Jordan and I are your kind of go-to contacts there. I work as the Certification Compliance Coordinator with Odot in the Certification Program Office. So just since it's kind of hard for everyone to introduce themselves, I wanted to give a quick overview of who signed up to be here today, just to give you an idea of who's here. So I think, as we mentioned, we had over 100 people registered for this training. We've got a number of consultants here, including some folks from Idaho. We also have a number of Odot employees here who have interactions with our certified local agencies. And we have at least 1 and up to 25 people registered from each of our certified LPAs. So it's really great to have a representative from from all of our certification or certified agencies here today. Jeannie, can we have the next slide, please?
Okay.
Oh, I guess we're on the objectives already, huh? Okay, so I can cover that. So objectives today for the training are first of all, we have a pretty packed schedule today, so we're going to be moving along. But by the end, we hope you take away an improved understanding of ADA and Tpar design and construction for federal aid projects. And we're going to have that illustrated by some perspectives from the local agency, from your local agency peers. Next slide, Jeannie. So there's a quick overview of today's agenda. After I finish up, we'll have David Morrissey give us a quick overview of ADA at Odot. And then Chandra Morgensen, Odot Senior ADA Standards Engineer, will present on ADA ramp design and construction. I will take a brief break because we'll have a lot to take in. And then after that, Justin King, Odot State Work Zone Engineer, will present on Tpar design and maintenance. Then we'll break and into some breakout rooms and give you all the opportunity to discuss in some smaller peer groups your experiences, successes, problems, issues you run into with ADA and Tpar. We'll reconvene and hear from our local agency panel on their experiences and close out the session with a Q&A opportunity. I just want to say a really big thank you to our speakers and to our local agency panelists for their time today. Next slide. So before I turn the training over to our presenters today, I want to provide just kind of an overall framework of how the certification program, certified LPAs, interact on ADA-related processes and make sure that you know where to look and where the resources are that are available if you have an ADA-related question. So the first thing to remember is that Odot does not certify local public agencies in ADA. Rather, Odot reviews and approves ADA-related design standards and design exception processes for use on federal aid projects. If your agency has approved ADA-related processes, this does not mean the agency can use those processes in every situation on a federal aid project. Work on or along the state highway system must follow Odot standards. On this slide, you can see we have multiple resources that are available to you if you have a question about what ADA processes apply or, to your projects. So we can start off, as we always do, with the LAG manual. There's multiple sections in the LAG manual that cover ADA and Tpar related issues. And you can see here a number are called out, but that's a really good place to start if you have any questions about these processes. You can also take a look at Bulletin 10127, which is linked here and it's available on the certification program website. That bulletin came out in 2018, but it's still current, and it describes the components of ADA processes, how to obtain approval for ADA processes, and the applicability of those processes in different situations. Each of our certified LPAs has their own quality program plan, and those quality program plans also have ADA-related provisions in them that are a really great reference to you as you're working through ADA-related issues. Additionally, you can look at your project agreements. Every project agreement will have language related to LDAs and provisions related to ADA that you can take a look at to reference what specifically should be applying in a specific project. And lastly, that's a certification program office. If you can't find an answer in any of these resources, or it's just not clear and you need further clarification, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us directly through the Odot certification mailbox with that email address noted there. And with that, giving that overall framework, I'm going to turn it back to Jeannie to introduce our first speaker.
Great, thank you very much, Hannah and Jordan. A lot of work went into developing this workshop today. And we're kicking it off with our first speaker, and that is David Morrissey from Odot's Office of Civil Rights. So welcome, David.
Unmute. There we go. You hear me all right?
Yes.
Great. Jeannie, be sure to just jump in if I miss I won't be necessarily watching the chat. And so if there's any
Yeah.
just.
We'll let Scott let you know if there are questions that come up.
Thank you so much. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for attending today. It's my pleasure to get to present to you and talk to you a little bit about ADA at Odot to help sort of frame our work in this area and why we do it. At Odot, one of our values is equity. And in this illustration, I'm sort of trying to just convey that when we create access for every member of our community, that results in community participation and inclusion. And ultimately that contributes to equitable outcomes, because everyone has an opportunity to participate in their communities because they can get out, access their sidewalks, access their public transit options, and fully participate. Our role as transportation practitioners really is crucial to independence for individuals with disabilities. While this illustration shows the modern redesign of the wheelchair man, which is sort of also used as a universal symbol for access. We really are, when we talk about ADA access, not just talk about wheelchair users, as our illustrations we'll talk about today will bring up. We're talking about the blind community, the deaf community, persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Even here in Monmouth, Oregon, where I live, we have a high population of individuals who are both deaf and blind, but there's a deaf-blind program here at Western Oregon University. So thinking about these different populations, I know will come up in your work as you implement the ADA. And toward that end, I know myself and our other panelists today who really bring a great expertise on design and engineering for universal access are available to you to help be a part of solution finding, so that everyone has access in their communities. So Jeannie, if you could move us forward to our next slide. We're gonna briefly just touch here, what is the Americans with Disabilities Act? Can't believe it, but in 2020, the ADA celebrated its 30th birthday. Unfortunately, because of COVID restrictions, I think some of the national and state level celebrations that would really bring together a big tent of disability advocates and so many others who care about this law to be put on hold, but we'll hope in a future year here there'll be chances to celebrate the ADA's 30th birthday. But what is it? The ADA is a federal civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in everyday activities. These activities may include accessing state and local government services like voting. They may also include activities in other public places, such as going shopping or eating at a local restaurant. And while we can't take a deep dive into the text of the ADA, I do want to sort of point out that from the text of the law early in the document, in stating a list of findings about the marginalization or disparate outcomes for citizens with disabilities, Congress found that in our country, and as well as we know now around the world, governments had failed to make modifications to existing facilities and practices, resulting in exclusion. And also that as in the United States, it's the right goal to regard persons with disabilities as equal members of our society in order to assure that we create equality of opportunity, we foster full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency for persons with disabilities. A broad vision in the text of the ADA. And again, our role as transportation practitioners really supports that vision. So let's move forward, Jeannie, to the next slide if we can. Title II of the ADA is really particularly relevant to you all. Title II is what applies to state and local government entities. It protects qualified individuals with disabilities from discrimination on the basis of disability in services, programs, and activities provided by state and local entities. Title II extends the prohibition on discrimination that was originally established in Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act in 1973, that all activities of state and local governments, regardless of whether these entities receive federal financial assistance. Part B of Title II focuses on public transportation services. Next slide, please. Title II, often you'll hear reference in a larger phrase, a Title II transition plan or a compliance program. At Odot, our ADA compliance program has both an internal and an external function. Our work with certified local agencies and our local government partners, you all, being a major area of our focus. But I did want to quickly share just a few points about where we are on our internal compliance, because that often touches on our external partnerships. Our internal compliance program and ADA Title II transition plan is really the foundation for this work. Since 1995, ODOT has been addressing ADA implementation through our transition plan. Transition plan covers all aspects of accessibility to ODOT facilities, meetings, online media, as well as the transportation system. Since 2017, the goal of our transition plan in its most recent version is to ensure that full program access is systematically planned and provided for people with disabilities. This plan conveys steps to address any deficiencies and subsequently drive progress to eliminate barriers to program access. ODOT's plan includes identifying new or remaining physical obstacles in the system that limit accessibility, describe the methods that ODOT will use to make those facilities accessible, and provide a schedule for making access modifications. ODOT's external compliance monitoring program includes confirming that local agencies have an ADA coordinator or an ADA contact staff person, as well as a complaint mechanism for stakeholders to report physical or programmatic barriers. These staff members should know how to log complaints, as well as their authority to try to resolve complaints at the lowest level before escalation to a formal ADA complaint. And we'll come back to that in a moment. In the same spirit, ODOT recommends that ADA access and accommodation requests be resolved quickly to avoid elevation to formal complaints or to put the local agency at risk of litigation. This risk management we'll talk about a little bit more on a later slide regarding our CQCR program and how we try to resolve ADA requests quickly and at the lowest, easiest level possible. Next slide, please. So some of you may have heard that, if I can move my notes forward, sorry, there we go. In addition to our Title II transition plan, you may be aware that ODOT is under a settlement with disability rights advocates. ODOT's ADA compliance has developed further in the context of this settlement since 2017. In 2016, a group of disability advocates brought together by the Association of Oregon Centers for Independent Living brought suit against ODOT, elevating their concern of areas that they felt that ODOT needed to do a better job, particularly around deficient curb ramps and general curb ramp and sidewalk accessibility on the state highway system. That was 2016, and a year later in 2017, we had an approved settlement agreement that will be operating under until 2032 is the current projected completion date. If you could move us to the next slide, Jeannie. What is on the table for the settlement? ODOT committed to inventorying and remediating non-compliant curb ramps on the state highway system over the next 15 years. Inventorying pedestrian signals with a remediation schedule yet to be established. Other actions include hiring an accessibility consultant, engaging community outreach. And then this one's crucial to today's topic. In the settlement, we agreed to assure that we were providing accessible routes through work zones and implementing a mechanism for people with disabilities to identify and resolve issues with our ADA facilities. This is what we'll look at in our next slide around comments, questions, concerns, and requests. ODOT's actively pursuing all the commitments in our settlement agreement. And just as of last week or the week before, our annual settlement report of the progress we've made in implementing the terms of the settlement went live on the ODOT website. That's submitted every year on or around March 31st. So the 2020 activity year report is now on our website. Let's see. So in closing on this slide, I think I'll say that meeting our commitments to the settlement agreement is a commitment the agency's made. We're working hard to it and toward that goal of completion of all terms of the settlement by 2032. However, our commitment to accommodate all users will continue well past that. So if you could move us to our next slide, please, Jeannie. So I mentioned it a moment ago, our ADA CQCR system, comments, questions, concerns, and requests. This is our customer input portal, essentially, where using our 855 hotline or our online web form or other ways like Ask Odot or just emailing me or contacting a staff member who will route the information up to the Office of Civil Rights. We're trying to create channels for persons with disabilities to be able to inform the agency of concerns, barriers in the system that need to be remediated, requests for things like audible pedestrian signals because of a hearing loss, or even an accommodation for a DMV service appointment, such as having a sign language interpreter for a knowledge test. What you don't see in that acronym CQCR is the word complaint. The CQCR system really is meant to try to facilitate solutions in a quick and straightforward manner in order to remove that barrier, provide that customer access to that program or system feature so that we can make it win-win, that they get the access they're seeking that we should be providing, and we're solving it quickly in order to avoid elevating to a formal ADA complaint process. We still thoroughly document those CQCRs because, of course, we want the data to show the amount of service we're providing around accommodations and access. And again, also in order to document that we really are being responsive to one of the concerns of the litigants in the settlement, that DMV listens to stakeholders, respectfully responds, and is again solution focused. The customer-driven concern system is centralized through the Office of Civil Rights, but it really relies on having great ADA experts throughout the agency, like we have in our other panelists today. And these include our active transportation liaisons at the local level and other experts, statewide technical units, such as you'll hear from today as well. I call this our one ODOT approach because everyone has a role to assure that our system and our services are fully accessible to every member of the community. I want to give a shout out to our partners in the Traffic Roadway Division and the Certified Programs Office. These are two really crucial teams to ODOT's ADA implementation as an agency and to our work to in service to you, our local partners in your implementation of the ADA. I really value these folks' knowledge because when we need it, we can tap their knowledge and get the right answer to those questions we receive. So I want to point something out that I think should be particularly relevant to you as our local government partners. We routinely receive inquiries from the public that turned out to be outside of ODOT's jurisdiction. And so you may hear from us in that we're transferring a concern to you. It may be it's not on the state highway system or it has to do with a local program. Once ODOT receives them, we contact the customer to get additional facts and do that sort of assessment in order to determine who's responsible for this, satisfying this inquiry. This leads to another great reason of why ODOT local partner agencies really should have an ADA coordinator or at least an ADA contact staff person that we can reach, as well as your own complaint mechanism for stakeholders to report physical or programmatic barriers. Sometimes we will hear from customers who know that the issue that they're bringing to our attention is not in our jurisdiction, but they're not getting a response or they don't know who to reach in their local county or city government to raise this concern. Or worse, they feel that they've tried to bring attention to it and it's being disregarded. And so they're turning to the state for attention. Your ADA staff members should know how to log complaints as well as what their authority is to resolve complaints at the lowest level before they escalate to formal ADA complaints. In the same spirit, ODOT recommends that access requests be responded to quickly and responded in a timely manner to avoid elevation to a formal complaint or to put your agency at risk for litigation. And so this is a nice moment, I think, for me to just share with you just a couple anecdotes of the sort of complaints, or I'm sorry, CQCRs that we have received just even within the last year. For example, today we're talking about temporary pedestrian access routes. We had an inquiry from a customer who uses what she described as a heavy power wheelchair. And she was concerned that the Tpar that had been constructed near her home wasn't going to support her and her chair. And so by connecting to the local team who had installed that Tpar and the right folks who could provide her that assurance that, no, this is a solid ramp, you can use it, and what other questions can we answer while we have you on the phone. Another example was we had a customer from the blind community and as well as an advocate for them who isn't blind, raising concerns about open pits and debris around a construction zone site that was in the public pedestrian right-of-way that this blind consumer routinely used as part of their regular routine. And suddenly it was disrupted by construction, and they saw significant risks. And so they were bringing that to our attention to avoid their own injury as well as injuries for others. Another example we received was a person who didn't identify as being blind, but does use a service animal, and had similarly encountered construction material debris, nails, what he described as metal shards on a walkway, and that this was a sidewalk route that led to a bridge over a canal in his town. And that he suddenly felt really unsafe trying to traverse a route that he and the dog had walked every day for a long time previously. What made it worse and elevated it to Odot was that when he attempted to, because one day he was trying to use the route, encountered folks from the local agency working on the project, and he tried to just bring their attention to the difficulty and the barrier in the route, that their reaction was they laughed at him, and he felt pretty disrespected. And so rightly so, he contacted Odot to ask for some support in his concern. An additional one that I found really interesting was a person driving the same route on their work to commute every day, and yet because suddenly there was a project that was resulting in traffic queuing, she was not aware of it, felt trapped in the queue, and because of a toxic pesticide poisoning that had early in her life had brought her chemical sensitivity, she suddenly was sick in the car, smelling what she called fumes. And while she understood the construction project had to go, she had asked, I just wanted to know that I should take a different route home. And so once she was contacted by the local agency who gave her information about the alternative routes that she could take around the construction so she could just avoid it, she was completely satisfied. So it was another example where just good communication really can be the solution that our stakeholders and consumers are looking for. Let's move to the next slide, please, Jeannie, and I'll bring us to a close in my section. I'm sorry, the previous slide. I didn't realize you'd already moved forward.
Oh, sorry. Is it this one?
No, backwards too.
Okay, let's see.
There we go. So I want to bring your attention to our 855 hotline. It's a toll-free number. Well, that does reach my office and the Office of Civil Rights. It's not only for ADA, but also Title VI and related discrimination concerns. Certainly, you're welcome to use this or convey it to consumers. And again, we'll use our usual processes around identifying whose jurisdiction is it and how can we serve the local partner to get that to you. Thanks, Jeannie. If you move us to our next panel right here. So our certified local agency partners in the audience today, you annually complete a self-audit. That is an evolving form that the questions in any particular year reflect issues we're hearing from the field or that you've even expressed that you have questions about. Currently in the section on civil rights programs, questions B and C really are focused on this ADA component. B, does ODOT's Office of Civil Rights have your agency's ADA Title II transition plan on file? And C, have revisions been made to your ADA design, exception, and inspection process since last submitted to ODOT? I would say that those two questions really are crucial for your agency's ability or eligibility for funds through ODOT. So we want to make sure that you're successful and that having these documents is not a barrier to your functioning. So if myself in the ADA program or our colleagues in certified programs can answer questions about these so you can keep your momentum in developing them, let us know. Last slide, please, Jeannie, is my contact information. Again, providing technical assistance or your ADA implementation is my pleasure and happy to be a resource to you. And I thank you for your work in general. And specifically, I think being here today on this issue of construction zone safety and access and temporary pedestrian, as I think the anecdotes, cases that I just shared, we've received convey. It's a serious issue, one that we are really trying to apply our best thinking and coordination to in order to really be able to tell our story as a state that the access and inclusion of every member of our community is important to us, and we're making it real. So thanks for your work, and look forward to the rest of the presentations.
Thanks, David. We have a few more minutes if anyone has questions for David. Do we have anything in chat, Shirlene? Or I have one question while you're thinking, David. We talked about responding to citizen concerns and questions. What's your sense of sort of a guideline or tip about how quickly agencies should plan on responding?
Sure. Happy to. Yep, that's a great question. Thank you. Under our settlement terms that I described a few minutes ago, ODOT has committed that when we receive a customer inquiry under the ADA, in the settlement, we've committed to a 10-day response window. We will respond. Doesn't mean we're solving the challenge, but we're at least responding to the customer and conveying we've heard you. We're collecting more facts as needed and moving our process forward. Procedurally, however, internally, we try to do that within 5 days. That's what matches Ask ODOT's, which is really one of the most major portals of input for all customers, ADA or otherwise, who have questions or issues about ODOT. They ask for a 5-day turnaround. So we really in OCR try to complete that as well. And reality is often it's within 24 hours. And just the reaction of relief and elation from customers that they get a call back within such a quick period of time can just make your day. So there's an encouragement right there. And the reality is, when you're faced with an ADA inquiry, it might be a long-term resolution process. It's a big project that's needed. This is going to take, a lot of planning. It's not something that can be turned tomorrow. To have been as quickly responsive to just the inquiry kind of softens that ultimate news that, hey, this is a big project. So again, you'll have more effectively engaged that customer from the start for then the hard work that is to come.
Good point. People want to be heard and acknowledged, and that makes them a little bit more patient in the resolution. Great, thank you. Any other questions? All right, thank you so much, David. That was awesome.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We will move to our next speaker, ADA ramp design and construction. Chandra Morgensen is with us from ODOT. She's the senior ADA standards engineer for ODOT.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for attending today. I've got a fair amount of material. I won't be able to go into a lot of details, but hopefully point you to some of these topics related to standards and processes, our design exception process, where you can find information. Our engineering for accessibility webpage is going to be really useful for folks in relation to ADA design standards and our processes, and also to make sure people are aware of our curb ramp Inspection training we posted online due to COVID and is up and running and available 24/7. With the exception of we are moving to the platform where we'll be down for a week or two when we have to transfer to a different platform. So that's what I'm going to kind of talk about today. Next slide, please. So we want to talk a little bit about Odot standards versus local standards, and to remember, I guess, the primary concept that curb ramps provide connections to enter and exit a street crossing or a sidewalk, whether or not they're marked or not. On the state highway means that it's a crossing across the highway. Along the state highway means it's a crossing that's parallel to the highway it serves on a local road. And both agencies have a responsibility to meet ADA requirements as a Title II entity. So state requirements take precedence on or along the highway, and the settlement agreement is for curb ramps that are on or along the highway. Next slide, please. So on along the state highway, ODOT's curb ramp process is to be followed. We have ODOT forms for checklists for the DEs. We have a process document that's available online. All of our inspection forms are specific for ODOT that go into our database related to our asset on curb ramps, as well as the ADA design exception form. Those are all available on the engineering for accessibility and need to be used when we're doing infrastructure on or along the state highway. So when it's on a local street, ODOT's process must also be followed unless the agency has been certified to deliver ADA. And when they're certified, the agencies have agreed upon forms and processes that are to be followed. We're having a little bit of an issue that I need to reiterate a couple of times is, again, that you must submit our curb ramp inspection form for anything on or along the highway. And it needs to be through the email process. There's a submit button on the form, and it will generate, I believe, a ticket for you that we've received it. And before we close out a project, we need to have that inspection form. So that's the avenue that our employees receive the form. Next slide, please. Thanks. So when an agency is certified for AD delivery, again, the agency agrees to follow the standards section of the local agency program agreement. When the project's not on or along the state highway, utilizing federal funding, including portions of the NHS system, you're going to use the processes approved by the state and federal highway. All right, next slide, please. So design exceptions, this is a snippet from our engineering page. You can get to this from the engineering from accessibility page. It's specific to design exceptions. There's a couple of accordions here that are broken down on the process for general roadway design exceptions, which you're probably very familiar with. And then we also have a separate tab to talk about the ADA curb ramp design exception forms. In each of those, there are instructions on how to submit, as well as the links to the forms and some of the checklists and processes for that. So they're slightly different, but in the end, the processes are outlined there if you expand that. Next page or slide, please. So when you are a certified agency with the design exceptions, when you're building infrastructure on the local facility, the DE is approved by the local agency and retained on file in your project records. When the facility, again, is on or along the state highway, it must come to ODOT and be approved by ODOT and federal highway if required. If the agency is not certified, you still need to use the ODOT form and inspection processes that are in place. We do have a chapter in the HDM, chapter 14, that talks about it. It's a little bit outdated as far as the ADA forms and processes, but it is a chapter in the HDM. On the general form, we do record some ADA design exceptions. These would be things more like sidewalk geometric requirements, and there's a separate checkbox on the general form to do that. So I believe on my next slide, I'll talk about, or one of the previous ones coming, what needs to be recorded on a general form versus an ADA curb ramp form. So look at the design exception page and the HDM. And if there's any ever question about which form to submit, please contact our headquarters office. We have contact names and numbers on the webpage to help ensure you're getting the right form submitted. So on this slide, we have a little bit of a flow chart when you're doing the design exception process. If you follow the left side, it's the process if you're on or along the state highway, and the right side if the facility is not on or along the state highway. So if an agency is delivering its own project, again, or on behalf of an uncertified agency, or the ODOT is delivering for a non-certified agency, you're going to submit the request to ODOT. Submitting a request is, again, not a guaranteed approval. So I suggest that you have early coordination with ODOT as soon as an issue is identified. You can contact me. We may have one of my team members help respond and review the drafts and make sure you're got the information needed to process a request. If it's not on the state highway, again, follow the right side, and the local agency prepares the documentation and retains the records. So next slide is basically the general design exception, which is very similar. The difference is if it is not on our facility, we will sign but not stamp the general design exception if it's not on our facility. All right, next slide, please. So I'm just going to go over a little bit of the ODOT curb ramp geometrics, just kind of highlight these. I think most people are aware of these. They're conveyed in the updated 900 drawings for Oregon. Running slope requirement, the design is 7.5% max, cross slope 1.5%. Our turn space and landing, we were having issues with construction being designed right at, for example, 4. So it was increased to allow a little bit of margin or a factor of safety. We use 4.5 by 4.5 or 5.5 feet when we have a back of ramp obstruction. And that's what the borough acronym there is for. Gutter slope, we do use the guidance from ProWag based on the stop yield or unsignalized, uncontrolled intersections. Counter slope design value is 4.0%. And the curb running slope, we're trying to start establishing best practice and standards. You may have seen a detail announcement that's been in development trying to provide some guidance about when to use various curb running slopes. The typical installation, we're trying to utilize 4%, which would be similar to the counter slope, and ensure that where the grade break is greater than 5%, we're meeting the blended transition requirement in the crossing, keeping it under 5%. Clear widths, 4.5 or 5.5 on cut throughs. Flare slopes, we have not established a design value. We recommend 9 to 9.5% just to be consistent with most of the other margins for construction to meet their finished grade requirement. A DE is required if it exceeds 10% on a flare slope. So we have yet to establish this best practice standard, but that's what I recommend. Again, 0 lips at grade breaks. A couple of things to note that are very specific to Oregon that are not in the PROAG or ADA standards. What we have had historically is that we provide 5 foot of separation between ramp runs and driveway panels that are effectively ramp runs. And then we provide at least 3 inches of curb reveal between 2 curb ramps with 1 foot of separation. We don't have design standards. Again, we see people designing to say 12 inches exactly. And so half the time they're going to meet that and half the time they're not. So I recommend, and I think we've updated the checklist to utilize 15 inches of separation as your design value to ensure we meet the requirement that we're intending. So next slide, please. On Odot Standards, this is the slide I was referring to a little bit earlier. Sometimes there's a little bit of confusion of what we document on which form. So if you're not clear, please contact Odot or our ADA design team. The ADA electronic form is primarily capturing the attributes of our curb ramp geometry. And we load that information into our database with the curb ramp asset. We're required to track that for our settlement report and agreement, the curb ramp attributes and how many DEs we're preparing. General DEs for ADA would cover items like when we deviate from the standard safety yellow on detectable warnings, if we're going to approve other materials such as cast iron or try some treatments which we don't have standards for, such as the tactile walking surface indicators, which are more of a guide strip for guiding low vision and blind pedestrians. So there isn't national standards. There's some reports and recommendations from federal highways. So we are seeing a lot more interest in some use of that. And so we want to keep in track of where we're installing and kind of monitor the performance when we experiment with that. So I think there will be more of that coming, certainly over the next decade and higher use. And then the other one that's on the general form, again, we talked about our sidewalk geometrics. So for example, our new construction standard width is 6 feet. And a DE is required if we don't meet our new construction standard. You can go to the next slide, please. I wanted to talk a little bit something that is unique to curb ramp design. Not only do we have what most people are familiar with in the design phase that we document when we deviate from a standard or we're not able to meet it because it was the maximum extent feasible. That we still record anything that is non-compliant. And so we have a pre-construction box that's marked on that form, which is intended for design deviations prior to the pour of the concrete. Before the design is done, or if during the contract, when you get out and we identify some issues, we might need to do a redesign. So there is a pre-construction application, and then the as-built should be pretty rare and is really about documenting final construction that's left in place that for some reason we were not able to meet the compliant requirements, and we would document that as well. So these really should be very small, and it might be due to a change in site conditions that we weren't able to control. So that would be an example of where we would do an as-built design exception. When there is something in the site that is revealed and we're not expecting it, please, please, please start working early with your engineers and notifying your liaison that we may have an issue so that we can work on the steps forward and make a contact with the engineer of record. They may have some additional information. So I think that's what I have about that. Let's move on to the next slide. So the other thing that's unique to the ADA curb ramp design exceptions form is that it must be electronic. Again, we have a large volume that we are processing, and so our form is set up so that auto-populates and loads into our database for design exceptions and can eventually populate our asset information with updated information. So it is required to be submitted electronically. It is also required to be digitally sealed with the engineer of record stamp. So ensure that your digital seal meets the OSBIL's requirements. It doesn't obscure any of your professional record information, such as your license number, expiration date, the portions of your name. And it must also include the phrase digitally signed, where you would normally sign your handwritten signature on a wet seal. OSBILS also requires a third-party certification for digitally signed seals. And I would warn that there is a little bit of a cost using digitally signed signatures for the agency as well as the person submitting. I would highly recommend that you utilize a draft review process through our office and region before submitting, so that we can just, we found that it's easiest to provide comments and feedback, and then you can copy that information into the electronic form and submit just one time. We don't have to continue to send it back if we have some comments or we're missing some information or find some errors in the document. You will be sent a link when it's approved that you can access. Thanks for advancing to the next slide. So this is a direct snippet from OSBILS on the requirements for digital signatures. I've covered the basics of it, but you can navigate to OSBIL and read a little bit more about the issue. I believe our technical pages also have some information about digital seal versus digital signatures, like on an Adobe form. So there is a difference between the seal requirements versus just a signature on a document, like a Word document that you might be signing. Next slide, please. And I'm going to have to hurry, it looks like. So again, this is our greatest resource, engineering for accessibility at Odot. If you Google in that term, it should come up pretty quickly. We have information on all of these different topics related to curb ramps, pavement, bridge, crossings, transit parking, Tpar, and the curb ramp inspection and inventory resources. And so the link is on the bottom of the slide, and you'll be finding a lot of information there. So in the next few slides, I'm going to kind of highlight, if you can go to the next slide, please. This is the tab when you expand down for curb ramps. You'll find, I've kind of circled this, where the curb ramp process document is for construction of curb ramps and some of the triggers and requirements. We have an exhibit here about our design gutter flow slope that's relatively new. If you haven't seen that, it's just to help inspectors as well as designers kind of highlight some of the typical situations. We have a tech bulletin on curb ramp scoping requirements. There's a link here to the standard drawings. The curb ramp drawings have all moved to the 900 series, and we have a few details in 1700s. You can go to the next slide, please. When you're scoping a project, this is probably going to be useful. It's now available to external folks, the FactStip tool. We have layers that we're continuing to improve. Externals can access this now, and I understand it's best to use Chrome. So recently we've added layers related to ADA that include the CQCR for internal tracking, And for externals, there's the ADA design exceptions and where we've closed crossings. So that will probably be useful to you. Thank you. For the next slide. A reminder on the pavement and surface treatments, there's a document in here, the MG 100 to -1071 on triggers, what's maintenance activities based on the pavement item that you're doing in the work. You can go to the next slide. On the signalized intersection, there is an MG 14403 that talks about signal items, which are describing maintenance versus alterations, which trigger push button upgrades, etc. Next slide, please. So on the crosswalks tab, you'll find the forms to process requests for the state traffic engineer on potentially closing a crosswalk and some of the other approvals. The policy I wanted to highlight that's recently been published, and you're going to want to get familiar with that, is where the locations of crosswalks are on the state highway. It was just posted and effective in February of this year. It's a 16-page document with various scenarios, and I think it's very informative. You will see something in there related to directionality and our desire to keep crossings and the curb ramps directional. There's discussion about a 15-degree skew angle when we're looking at some of these closures, and that's referencing the center line alignment, essentially, of the curb ramp position 1, or the one that you would enter and exit into the street. That's what that's referring to. And if you have some more questions about that, you can contact me or one of our ADA team members. Next slide, please. So for Oregon statute, every intersection is a pedestrian crossing unless the crossing is closed by an official action. You may want to adopt our policy on where crossings are. And again, we've got to make sure that the sidewalk and crossings are available so that users can enter and exit the facility. I think it's been a little bit of a learning curve for folks to understand about the triggers with the pavement. But the other one that we're seeing is we're getting lots of questions about when the sidewalk is altered. And just remember that you're altering, it's kind of the same idea. If you're altering the sidewalk, you're needing to address the curb ramp when you're at that corner location. And that any closure must have an official action on file. Next slide, please. So this is just a reminder about the processes are outlined in the traffic manual for closing crosswalks. When it's on a local facility, the local agency must process the closure for the local street system. And when ODOT's delivering the project for a local agency, in that circumstance, we will request the document for any closure on a local street to retain in our project records. And this documentation essentially serves as our document to not provide 2 curb ramps per corners. So we don't have an ADA/DE to code for a single ramp when this scenario, a closure occurs and is approved. That's the documentation. So we don't duplicate it twice. We do, however, look to have the information on the curb ramp detail so that everyone's aware that it is closed and that they don't need to provide it. And also on our curb ramp details, we provide any other ADA/DEs, a number for all individuals so they can reference that document for construction, inspection, and design review. Next slide. Crosswalks, again, aren't to be blocked by parked cars, and the curb ramps are to fall within the crosswalk. Oregon law prohibits parking within 20 feet of a crosswalk. Leading end and trailing end includes mid-block crossings. We have utilized curb extensions, can be helpful, both the curb ramp design and helping enforce the prohibition of parking at the corner. Next slide, please. This is an example of a couple of installations that we are trying. Curb ramps, again, serve pedestrians to access a facility, and driveways are to serve a vehicle accessing the property adjacent. So they have two different functions. They should be designed to be separately, but we know that in a lot of our intersections, they're very close proximity. So the illustration on the left is a concept that we've been trying out, where we provide basically a little bit of a raised curb reveal in between the driveway throat and the curb ramp throat. On the right is another example where you might be able to actually integrate the driveway configuration in a curb extension and still provide separation. So if you have a driveway very close on a corner, consider incorporating that access in the curb extension. We can move to the next slide. This is the detail that we have available and has been in development, looking for feedback, seeing how much success we're having. Basically there's three scenarios. Trying not to introduce grade breaks unnecessarily. So if you have a raised or super elevated crossing, we're going to want to try to keep the cross slope of the sidewalk similar with the curb running slope. Most of the situations, to ensure proper drainage, we don't have ponding at the bottom of the curb ramp. 4.0% is the design value on the curb running slope. And then the ramp run that you're entering and exiting could be a variable. So it could also apply on your, basically the parallel configurations or many of the other design configurations we have. And then when the curb running slope begins to be 5% or greater, we're needing to make that monolithic construction so there's not an inconsistent ramp run between the curb running slope and the ramp run that exceeds 5%. So that's what those three areas are trying to illustrate, trying to ensure folks are thinking about drainage. And remember that ODOT requires on new construction inlets upstream of our curb ramps, regardless of the contributing area. So that will also help facilitate that we don't have ponding and debris collection in front of our curb ramps. Many of our existing facilities, there may be some challenges. We may not have storm drainage or inlets in place. So just be mindful about that and look at your drainage issues. Next slide, please. On the bridge tab, I just wanted to point out we had an updated drawing related to pedestrian handrail and pedestrian fencing. Metal handrail is used primarily to allow a pedestrian to bear weight and traverse a ramp. Serving a building entrance, for example, it's different than pedestrian fencing, which is going to be more for hazards that are parallel to the roadway, like a steep fill or running stream. You should note that on the pedestrian metal handrail that there is an optional rail. ADA requires a 1 foot additional surface for canes and other things that they don't slip off as they kind of splay while they're traversing the area. Or it can have the railing, which is not to exceed 4 inches of exposure or clearance for a cane to go through. So it's very similar to what you would probably see on your deck railing. You're going to see that lower bar. So kind of look at those details if you're using railing and fencing. The other thing is we are also finding that bridge joints, we need to pay more attention to those in the access route. The surface requirements really should be flushed. I know that may not always be feasible, but we need to ensure that we don't have gaps exceeding a 1/2 inch in the direction of pedestrian travel. And there's some geometric requirements in the ADA standards and PROAG about level changes when we need to utilize that for some of the bridge joints. So contact our bridge folks or our unit if you have some questions on that. Next slide, please. I added recently a tab because we've been getting questions about transit and parking. The parking was already there, but I pointed to the chapter in our highway design manual about transit facilities. So that's a good reference. If you can go to the next slide, please. We also have a tab for accommodating pedestrians in the work zone. Justin probably has much more information on his work zone site, but this has a couple of the bulletins maintaining access during maintenance activities, and a temporary Tpar plan is required for projects as well. Next slide, please. So as we talked about, temporary Tpars are a critical element for traffic control that includes bicycles, pedestrians, and ADA accommodations through the work zone. And they need to be equal to or better than the existing access prior to construction. Next slide. And then the last, and then there's another very meaty section in here on curb ramp inventory and inspection. There's a reminder that there's online training, something that we added fairly new. If you need to check if someone is certified in ADA as required by the contract, we have a list of the certifications that's maintained by our construction unit. I kind of highlighted there. Next slide. And then on the expanded tab, we have the frequently asked questions about curb ramps and inspection. We had a lot when we rolled out the 2020 class. There's the tech bulletin about measurement criteria when a DE is in place. The submittal guide is new, again, walks you through the steps on how to submit the form. There's also one for the push button. We have references here to the exhibit and numbering curb ramps in our methodology, and also for the push buttons, the type of surfaces that we have another little handout for folks to help make it easier. Next slide. Reminder, the curb ramp inspection training is available. Has about 10 units. One of them is an exam. The certification is valid for 1 year. We'll resume some on-site training when we are able to based on COVID, but currently everything is online. And we are developing a pocket guide that's not available yet, but will be available for print just as a little field guide that you might be able to take with you on site as some quick reminders for inspection. Next slide. So the completed form, again, is very critical for ODOT's business needs. We need to collect those to monitor our settlement, report progress. Please submit those with the submit button, and it cannot be flattened. So you need to hit the submit button. And you can keep a flattened copy in your project records if you'd like. So we do realize there's a few gaps in training. We developed some courses for our internal staff this last spring and a year ago. COVID kind of threw everything off. So they're partially developed, and I'm looking to try to get some of this stuff online as soon as I can. So you may see some more materials available. And the last, one of the last slides here, we're experimenting with some of our pilot projects. We don't have anything that's really resolved or recommended at this point based on the pilot projects. We're looking at cost saving measures and all of the different areas, right away, PE and construction. More and more of our curb ramp construction is going to fall into our regular STIP work. Next slide. If you have suggestions or concerns for the specs or standards, we have 2 links that you can submit some information. They will get to probably Will or Will Woods is our senior standards engineer. You will see some periodic emails from me if you are on a subscription list that I have specifically to ADA. So my email's on here and you can request me to add you to that list. And I do typically title that ADA forms, guidances, and best practices. So if you'd like to be on that, send that to me. Yeah, that's everything I have. So thank you. I know that was a lot.
Thanks so much, Chandra. We're a little bit over, so with that, we'll go to break and let's be back in 10 minutes. So be back at 10:20 for our next speaker, which is Justin King with Odot.
Hopefully everybody's back from their little break. My name is Justin King. I am the Odot State Work Zone Engineer. And the purpose of this part of the presentation.
You're going to craft an email before what?
The purpose of this part of the presentation is to introduce the participants to temporary pedestrian accessible routes, and we shorten that to Tpar. And also to introduce people to Tpar, which is basically the path or method to get pedestrians through or around work zones. Just a little Tpar history for nationally and Oregon. Of course, in 1973, the Americans with Disability Act was introduced. I believe that became a law in 1991 with the ADAG. And then also during that time frame, PROAG was kind of introduced. It didn't show up in the manual on uniform traffic control devices until about 1993, that you had to accommodate all forms of traffic. And then it didn't show up in the Odot standards necessarily until about 2002. That's as far back as I can find that. And it was pretty generic that you had to accommodate all forms of traffic through work zones. And then it really, the pavement didn't hit the road until 2016. Got sued and had the settlement with AOCIL. As far as ADAG versus PROAG, ADAG is a law, and that was introduced in 1991, I believe, and became a law. PROAG, ADAG is more aimed at buildings and some other things like infrastructure buildings, whereas PROAG, the public rights-of-way accessibility guidelines, are more aimed at public facilities out on like streets, sidewalks, and etc. The PROAG is proposed and is, I believe is in line to be introduced as a law here some point, but right now it's just guidelines. And so, but the MUTCD, ODOT, and others treat PROAG as the standard for accommodating pedestrians. So just some definitions for you. Pedestrian, it includes any person walking with accessibility needs, including people with accessibility. Accessibility is continued access to facilities during work. So that's not only through the work zone, but if there's buildings within that work zone, you got to maintain access to those also. Or even like private residences, houses, anything that's in or around your work zone, you got to maintain access to. And Tpar, pedestrian accessible route, that is the area used by pedestrians to navigate through or around the work zone or the work area. And then ODOT does require a temporary pedestrian accessible route plan. It can be written, so it doesn't have to be an actual like plan sheet, but it could be a method of, hey, we're gonna stop work at this point and move out of the way, and we'll verbally talk to people and get them through, or it can actually be a drawing that we show and implement. And that just identifies the required responsibilities and components within Tpar. So a Tpar for a maintenance operation might look a lot different than a Tpar for like a STEP project. For Tpar standards, the Odot standards are in the Odot Traffic Control Plans Design Manual. We publish that every year and update it. And those are in line with the MUTCD, and it covers both design and construction. And basically, the Odot standard is to provide equal to or better level of accessibility. So if the current level of accessibility is like a sidewalk, then you got to basically provide something that looks like a sidewalk. But Odot owns a lot of roads that do not have sidewalks. And so we had to find a way to accommodate those areas. And so it's not necessarily always ADA compliant per like ProWag, but no new barriers to accessibility. So full standards is kind of what Chandra covered. So if your existing facility you're in a town and you have sidewalks and they're all meet standard, then you're effectively meeting that same standard in construction. So it's gonna look like is a 60-foot width, 88 of your path, it's like a standard sidewalk, and then ADA compliant ramps. You can't go down to 48-inch width paths with 60-inch passing spaces every 200 feet. And but it is important to have ADA compliant ramps. And then it is important also to consider that separation between not only the, consider that separation between the path that you're routing pedestrians and versus traffic, and that path you're routing pedestrians versus the work area. So there's different devices, concrete barrier or a PCD like you see in this picture that can do that job. And then of course, that path needs to be continuous. So there shouldn't be any gaps in that path. So why doesn't Odot always use the full standard? Because as you can see here, we have a wide variety of highways. This might be a little different for a city where your whole network is sidewalks, but counties are going to have some of these, rural county roads, and Odot has the same. And you can see, like in the middle picture, it's just basically a shoulder, a paved shoulder. And then up on Mackenzie Highway, I don't even know if you can consider that paved shoulder. It's through effectively a lava flow. So but we still have to accommodate peds in these areas, and there's lots of bikes up there also, riding around. And then some of our existing infrastructure, that's the Caveman Bridge and Grants Pass, that doesn't meet full standards, but for the width of the sidewalk, and it would be very difficult to meet full ADA standards in that situation and get people off. So that's really why we had to kind of find a different standard than just full, and it's equal to or better than, with no no new obstacles to accessibility. So Tpar, equal to or better than, match that existing level of accessibility. And if you can't, then you need to provide an alternate method to accommodate peds. So that could be a detour. What Odot is using is also using flaggers to get pedestrians through. So we stop the cars and use the flaggers to allow the pedestrians to get through the work zone. So they basically have that space available to them. There has been some projects that have used shuttles. The Oregon City Bridge shut down between Oregon City and Westland, shut down for a year or two. And basically the project used a full-time shuttle to get people from around that work zone. And the reason for that was the detour route was effectively I-205 to get across the river. And so that wasn't viable for pedestrians or bicyclists. So I think that project worked with TriMet and had a full-time shuttle to basically get people around that bridge. And then it's also okay if you treat everybody the same. So a full closure to all traffic, you can close it to pedestrians. But if you accommodate traffic by a detour or alternate route, then you also need to accommodate pedestrians in the same form. So, but as long as they're treating people equally and you close the road, that is acceptable. So there is not a lot of standard drawings out here. There is a couple, but each project is different and is going to require a project specific solution. And that's part of the reason that we don't have a lot of like standard drawings for this. What we've noticed in the past is just using the standard drawing doesn't work. And so we want the Tpars to be project specific during design. It's also important to realize that if the standard is the existing, and then once we start constructing, the existing goes away, that we need to document what the existing condition was. Otherwise, it could be hard to prove that you're meeting the standard. So it's very important to do that. And a lot of projects get a survey. And so that's a form of documentation. If you have photos or just a video drive-through of the project, it can go a long ways to documenting what was there before you started tearing it apart. Because what's going to happen is if your Tpar does not meet standards, then someone's going to come through and go, hey, this, everyone's trained to meet the standard. So if it doesn't, then someone's going to come through and say, hey, this is not meeting the standard. You guys are not following the law. And you need to have some documentation and proof that says, no, the standard is equal to or better than, here's what was there before, and here's what we're doing that meets that standard. So the way that Odot does that is document it in a transportation management plan. And so that we have that information available if something comes up. Similar to permanent standards, if you have a full standard sidewalk on the other side of the street and you're going to use this substandard area, it doesn't make sense to go out of our way to bring this up. I mean, that's the whole point of the project, right? Is probably upgrading both of these sides. And so there will be some places where you can't meet the full standard. And what it's important there to do is just document why. You still have to have a continuous path, but in this case, if you're detouring traffic from the other side of the street to this side and this ramp doesn't meet the slope criteria or something, we're not going to go in and replace this ramp. We're going to use it, but it's just important that you document, hey, this area doesn't meet it, and the solution is a lot harder than than this available option that we have. So again, we document those in the TMP. Odot does not have a formal process for documenting temporary design exceptions, but we do want those documented in our transportation management plans. Some other design considerations for your Tpar. Make sure you know what you do your inventory like we talked about, know what's there. And then if you can, try to find some anticipated pedestrian volumes. If we're in Eastern Oregon, or like Southeastern Oregon by Rome, and there's not a lot of pedestrians, we still have to accommodate them, but the solution might be a less standard than, it's less risky to have a little bit less accommodation out in Eastern Oregon than it is in like downtown Portland or something. So if you can, try to get some anticipated design pedestrian volumes. And then it is important to know the scope of work, obviously, and then the duration of that scope of work. If you're there for 15 minutes, the Tpar is going to look different than if you're there for 15 months. And then also let's look for opportunities. I know on some of our projects, there's like a pedestrian path that is a little bit out of direction, like a park or a little pedestrian bridge. But those are opportunities you can use when during your project to route pedestrians to a different route and not have to actually use your project area to get pedestrians through. One part of the settlement was public notification and outreach. It is important during both design and construction. And if you can, through your media or if there's a citizen group or stakeholders, you can identify those. So if you're in Monmouth and you know that there is a community of blind pedestrians at the college, then why don't we go talk to them and ask them what is best for the project. And so try to do some outreach during design. And then of course, we post all of our projects on a website. And then along with the outreach, it's also important that during construction that we notify people what's changing. So there is a 10-day advance notification requirement, both, and that is done by Odot on the web and on site. And I'll just kind of show you some of the signs that Odot is using. So for short duration, if we're on the sidewalk and we're gonna move equipment, if there's a pedestrian shows up, we use this top sign. And then for longer term impacts, we have kind of a advanced sign that says, hey, the sidewalk's gonna be closed during this time frame, use a detour, or when the detour is in place, an actual sign that says follow the detour. So now once the design plan is in place, now it's time to work that plan in construction. So you got to implement that public notification strategy. And one thing important before you get into construction, if the contractor modifies the traffic control plan, they also need to include a modified Tpar plan that goes along with that. So you don't want to have them propose a different traffic control plan that doesn't work with the existing Tpar. And then Odot APA specs require modified plans, including Tpars, to be stamped by an engineer. So if the contractor is proposing a different traffic control plan and Tpar, then those need to be stamped. Just some construction considerations. A Tpar is required. We came across this project. This is an Odot project in region, well, doesn't matter where, I guess, but and they obviously just started tearing apart and there was nothing there. So it is important that we have a Tpar. And if there's not one on the project, it doesn't matter, it's still required. And then it is also important for the inspectors to document the Tpar and the daily traffic control logs, inspection reports, both before and after every shift and probably during the shift too. But when Odot does a compliance review, they're looking for making sure that the Tpar was in place and working. And so that's an important part of doing that, is the inspection and documenting that the Tpar was in place daily and it was working. The Tpar has to work. Obviously, there's not 4 feet of space to get through this area. So this Tpar, while in design probably looked good, the placement of the barrels is making it so it's not working. And effectively, what a good analogy is if you have a shopping cart and you're an inspector, and you can walk your shopping cart, before the project begins and after it ends through the project, then you basically have a full-blown standard Tpar there. It has to work at all times. This project used a business sidewalk got an easement to use a business sidewalk for the Tpar, and then the contractor parked their own equipment right across the Tpar. So it needs to work at all times. So maybe some cones or something in this situation would be prudent along the sides of that to kind of stop that would happen. And it has to be maintained. So that's why it's important at the end of the day, especially after, because during the day that the contractor is going to have to get within these areas to do the construction. So at the end of the day, it needs to be maintained. And that's what we've seen a lot, is that the Tpar is placed at the beginning of the project and then it's not maintained throughout the life. And it has to be continuous. Obviously here it's a little skinny. So it's important to have a continuous route that meets the standards through their whole project. And just kind of a side note here that caution tape is not a ADA compliant device. So ODOT does not condone using caution tape anywhere technically, but if it's not part of a Tpar and you want people to keep out, then it does a function, but it should not be alongside or used as part of a Tpar. So ODOT, as far as the Tpars, is using the 3 E's to success. That's educating people, so going to these type of meetings and making sure that they kind of know what the standards are. And then engineering is putting those standards in our manuals for available for use. And everybody's obviously more than willing to use our standards or copy them however they need. And then the third part that is kind of, we have a little bit more, you know, it's going to take some time, but is the enforcement, and that's getting our inspectors out there and enforcing Tpars. Obviously it's change and contractors are resistant to change, and even some of our inspectors are resistant to change. But to be successful and have a successful Tpar, you got to have all 3 of those legs. And if you just one of those fails, you know, then it doesn't work very well. So just some typical accommodations that ODOT has for Tpars. I already mentioned this one once, but on our 2-lane roads, we have we have a single lane closure. We're using the flaggers to basically as a Tpar. So the flagger stops the vehicles and gets the traffic through. You can see on the lower picture this is actually a freeway, and in locations, the pedestrians and bicycles can use the freeway. You can see that shoulder is kept wide to accommodate pedestrians. So we've just basically maintained that shoulder width using those barrels. And then also on the picture on the right, you can see that we have a temporary signal, and we actually have a push button out there so that they can get an extended green and get through the signal area, closed area. In urban areas, we do have one standard drawing for that, and it's basically working on a corner at a time or diverting around the work area if you're working on a sidewalk. The new standard for closing a sidewalk for ODOT does look like the picture on the right, where you have basically a U, so it's very obvious that you can't go through that direction. The new MUTCD will have the standard that if you're closing a sidewalk, it has to be blocked across the whole face of it, similar to that PCD. And then it's also important to maintain access to pedestrian push buttons and other stuff. So, but a lot of that is going to be project specific, and the solution can be scalable to the proportion or to the impacts in the existing facilities. So here's just a simple Tpar example. We're working on some ramps, and we just effectively closed that corner of the parking lot and got people down onto into the parking area with a ramp. Or on a more complex project, you're gonna have a very complex Tpar, including either routing PEDs into the road or behind the curb ramps. Some of the devices that we can use for Tpars, you can use existing facilities. So if you have existing crosswalks, push buttons on signals, that's the best. Pedestrian channelization devices are on our QPL and basically are ADA compliant and guide pedestrians through areas. We allow for ramps. We have some, what you see there, like a one piece that is modifiable that you can put out there. They're a little expensive, or we do allow basically concrete or asphalt that is shaped in the form of a ramp. But we do not use cold mix. We've had problems with cold mix. There's no mention of cold mix. So if you're an inspector or you're looking at that, I would not use cold mix. ODOT has had issues where wheelchairs basically sink into the cold mix. And then next thing you know, the fire department shows up and has to get the people out. So obviously signs to route pedestrians through and guide them. And then vehicles, there is a shuttle bid item in our specs. And we also use pavement markings in other forms. So this is an example of a temporary crosswalk. And then some of our projects have used local transit. I would prefer, I think it's preferable to use local transit over a pedestrian shuttle vehicle. The transit is in place. You don't have to pay for the vehicle, but there does need to be some coordination in design with the local transit agency. ODOT has gone so far as using this for like almost like a 100-mile detour. They closed I-84 basically, and you could get to the casino at Pendleton, and there was a shuttle that went from Pendleton to LeGrand. And so ODOT paid for users of I-84 to take that shuttle. Obviously, we've talked about the flaggers. You can use flaggers to accommodate pedestrians. And then also the surface needs to, we don't define what the surface has to be made of. We define the performance characteristics of that. So the surface of the Tpar needs to be non-slip, firm, and has to have the width characteristics. And so we've used plywood, and plywood by itself is slippery when wet. So generally plywood needs some type of a coating. We've used big mats, almost like a landscaping mat. But and as long as that surface is smooth and firm, then it's okay. And that's kind of our specification. So we there's been some innovative solutions to that in projects. And then of course, if the existing facility is using truncated domes, then the new facility also has to use truncated domes, or the temporary pedestrian accessible route needs to use those. And even if the existing facility isn't using them, you should still be using the truncated domes.
Justin, before you move on to the next slide, we have a couple of questions and comments in the chat box about the prior slide.
Okay.
The question was, what Tpar standard drawing was that? And then we have a comment that says, I believe he showed TM 844 and TM 850. So can you confirm for folks before we get too far past the slides?
Yes, this is TM 844. And then I believe, yes, this is also TM 850 in our standard drawings. So yes, whoever posted the answer was correct.
Thank you.
So just to review the Tpar fundamentals, equal to or better than existing is our standard, no new obstacles. It's important to do that outreach during design and construction, and then do those 3 E's, get the engineering where you need it to be in both design, and then educate your designers and inspectors, and then of course, enforce those standards. It's becoming more and more important. The enforcement mechanism the public has for enforcing that ODOT has a Tpar is basically the court system, and we don't want to go that direction. Some lessons learned is what we see in a lot of projects is there's lack of comprehensive, consistent guidance through the Tpar. So you get to an area and you don't even know where to go, right? And so it's important to guide people through. And if you're using PCDs, it's in a couple signs, then it becomes really obvious where you need to go. And then of course, lack of maintenance, unfortunately or fortunately, the Tpar needs to be maintained effectively at all times. What does that mean for an inspector and for the contractor? You know, that's a minimum. Make sure it's working at the end of the day, right? Every day. And that's one of the lessons learned we've had. And then, of course, the contractors like using the caution tape, and that is not a device that is ADA compliant or should be used near or around a Tpar. Just some additional information. I think Chandra has already shown the accessibility website for Odot. We also have all of our work zone Tpar standards on our work zone webpage. And then I have 3 people in my group, and we all have access to the work zone standards at Odot email. So you can always email us there and we'll get back to you. An issue. And then we do also have actually it's every other month now, but a Tpar meeting. It's the 3rd Tuesday of every other month at 1 p.m. at the Odot TLC. It is a remote meeting. So you can call in, but basically what we're doing there is, and it's open to anybody. So if cities, counties, consultants, we've had utilities there, we've had traffic control companies there. But basically we're going over what's changing in the, the standards for Tpar. And then we also have a section there to discuss solutions to projects. So with that, thank you, everybody. And I'm going to turn it over to Shirley.
Welcome back, everyone.
That was a quick discussion, but we really wanted to provide you with some time to talk to your colleagues. Just a really quick debrief. Does anyone have any great pearls of wisdom or something that they discovered during their breakout session that they want to share? You can either call it out now or put it into chat.
Hey, what's going on, neighbor?
Okay.
And
One thing that came up in our group I wanted to share was that we don't have a good resource out there to do a cost estimate on Tpar plan when we are putting our independent cost estimate together or estimate for a statement of work in general. Given it that every plan would be project specific, however, there's not much resource on estimating and for what we need on projects.
That's a good point. And each one is so unique, and that's really important for you all to share amongst yourselves as local agencies, learn from each other's successes and challenges. We're getting some good comments in chat, so be sure to review that. Any other comments anyone wants to make before we go to our local agency panel?
I was just going to respond to that one comment.
Okay, go ahead.
While you might not, obviously you don't have the resources, that's an issue, but if you have developed a plan and are having a problem estimating it, ODOT does have a estimation tool that includes most of the Tpar items, so you can get at least a general estimate.
Great, thank you, Justin. That's really helpful. Any other comments? All right, I'm going to share the screen, and O'Brien Deering asked it. Justin, can you post a link to that estimation tool? And I'm going to share the screen and introduce our panel now. And we have 3 local agency people who have been willing to join us: Joel Howie, Clackamas County, Chun Wong from PBOT, and Derek Jensen from Lane County. And they're each going to share their experiences with ADA and Tpar. And then we'll have a question and answer session in which you can pose questions either to our panelists or to the other speakers that we've had today. So with that, I will turn it over to Joel Howie with Clackamas County. Thanks for joining us, Joel.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Great to see everybody. Good morning, good late morning. Good to see everybody in two dimensions. The latest version of Clackamas County's transition plan, this is from 2017, mentions that we have 4,745 non-compliant curb ramps that need retrofitting. Of those, 3,963 were built before passage of ADA, and then 700 after, which is not a good thing. And then, of course, those two numbers don't add up to 4,745, so we have about 82 or so. We're not sure when they were built. The transition plan does prioritize arterial streets and collector streets over other streets, and so we have about 1,700 on arterial streets that we're prioritizing first, and then 659 on collector streets. And the estimated duration of repairing all those is 12 and a half years. Go ahead and go to the next slide. We're falling short on the transition plan goals, mainly because of logistics of various things. Definitely high ramp design costs. So we're finding for consultant design, when it includes a traffic signal, is about $7,500 per ramp, and then 2 ramps per corner. So it can be about $15,000 per ramp corner. I'll show an example where we have 30 signalized ramps that we're working on Sunnyside. So the total cost is about $600,000. As throughout Clackamas County, the right-of-way isn't always in the place where you think it is. So sometimes we're finding we do have some right-of-way needs just to encumber, make sure that we're covering the ramp itself. And then the county itself has challenging terrain, hills and valleys and things like that. And so we're looking at another model similar to PBOT, so we can be more cost effective, and some of that will include not actually doing a full-blown survey, but doing relative elevation surveys. And then PBOT also has a model of using on-call contractors and task order contracts and just setting up per unit prices. So we'll be looking at that. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So other kind of items of interest from Clackamas County is on our non-federal projects, we are using, we kind of modified Washington County's inspection form, which includes a allowance of a 1/4 inch lip at the gutter/ramp connection. PROAG does allow that, but the ODOT form pretty much says if there's any lip, it's non-compliant. So we are using that form. We also have, and this is mainly driven through developer construction of ramps. Our county process allows the contractor or the builder an appeals process. If the county does determine the ramp is not compliant, the builder can hire an independent surveyor to conduct a survey to demonstrate compliance. We've also used our own in-house survey group to go out and do, take a total station out there and totally get, millions of points on a ramp, and it's pretty cost effective and easy to demonstrate compliance or non-compliance in that manner. But typically, if it's a developer, we're going to require them to hire the surveyor. But on our construction projects, we'll use our own survey group. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So here's kind of example, both design challenge and Tpar challenge. It's a little bit fuzzy here. North is up, south is down, east is to the right, west is the left. This is Sunnyside Road, which has an ADT of 36,000 on that northwest corner and the southeast corner. There is a median island there with slip lanes there. So the Tpar challenge is, so on the southbound 122nd to westbound Sunnyside right turn slip lane, it's a heavily used corridor both by pedestrians and trucks and traffic. So we can't close that lane because of the skew angle. For trucks, you couldn't be able to take bypass that median island and take a right. It would put them into the other lane. So we have to keep that slip lane open. We did determine that the slip lane could be narrowed down to 11.5 feet based on the truck turning radius, which is good. That immediate corner has a Mod Pizza there and other businesses that attract pedestrians. And so doing the Tpar is also a challenge. But we determined that it would be about 920 feet, to move pedestrians across the street on the south side of Sunnyside, move them over to the next intersection and come back around. It's about 920 feet out of direction travel. And we're calling that okay, kind of following ODOT's guidance. Let's see if we go to the next slide. So this is kind of more on the design challenge side. The left picture is the kind of that northwest corner, and then the median island to the right is just the median island that's there. So the options at the corner, so the existing grades at that sidewalk. So this Sunnyside was constructed in the late 90s. And so there's really nothing compliant about the existing ramp, but they did their best at balancing all the grades. So one option we were looking at is just adding truncated domes to the ramp. That's option one. The option two is to provide compliant landings. So the existing grade coming down the hill on 122nd is 17%. So this shows we're gonna meander the sidewalk a little bit to try to help the grades there. But the grades still would increase from that 15 to 16% to 20%, but then we'd at least have a flat landing there. And the other option that we were considering was just ripping out the whole intersection there, the median island and the ramp to really try to do a better job at balancing the ramps. But again, trucks going down 122nd to the other side of, or to right turn Sunnyside wouldn't be able to make that turn. So we settled on this meandering sidewalk, at least with compliant ramps or compliant landings. And I think that's it for me.
All right, thanks so much, Joel. Next up, we have Chun Wong from PBOT, City of Portland.
Sorry about that, I was on mute. First thing I want to cover is the ADA ramps and what we do. So City of Portland is under a settlement with CREEK, that stands for Civil Rights Enforcement, and I'm sorry, Civil Rights Education Enforcement Center. It's based out of Colorado. They go around and sue cities for not having compliant ADA ramps. So we're under a 12-year agreement that was signed in 2018 that runs through 2030, and one of the requirements is that the city's committed to building 1,500 ramps a year. The other thing that we're also under, that we agree to, is that we're using the 2010 ADA standards. I think most of the state, including Odot, is using ProWag. So it's a different standard. Another requirement under the creek settlement is that we have to do a conditional assessment survey of all ramps in the city. So that's still an ongoing process, and we continue with that. Where we get our ramps comes from a few different sources. One is our capital program, builds ramps. Another major source is through development. The third is we have utilities that will have to, when they come in and they destroy a corner, they end up having to put back compliant ramps. So we have the private utilities such as PGE, PPNL, Northwest Natural, and also public utilities. We have our Sewer Bureau, Bureau of Environmental Services, and the Water Bureau. They built actually quite a bit of ramps a year. I think Environmental Services built probably like 100 ramps in the past year for PBOT. So that's kind of nice. We don't end up paying for that out of our budget. The other leg of our that we have our ramps come from is our maintenance operations. Every time they do a paving job, they're out there installing new ramps. We have a program called Ramps by Request that citizens have mobility issues, they call that, and we build ramps through that. And then also the maintenance operations has a program that they go around through each sector of the city and they build ramps. So we have like 5 major quadrants in the city, and I think they just pick one area every year and they kind of rotate and build those ramps. So out of all those, we hopefully we'll get our 1,500 ramps a year. The challenges that we face is that most of our improvements are in the full build environment. We're not building a lot of new streets, a lot of new subdivisions. It's rebuilding a lot of what we have. So things that kind of limit what we can do to meet ADA is we have like narrow sidewalks, narrow right-of-ways. We have a lot of buildings that are 0 setback from the property line. So trying to meet doorways, that's always a challenge. Another thing that we always run into also is that people in Portland loves trees. And so even though if you're an engineer, it makes complete sense to take a tree out to put in ramps, there's usually a lot of pushback from neighbors that says, we'd rather keep the trees and, not bring the sidewalks and ramps up to standards. And I think they just don't understand that. And again, disability is a matter of when and not if you're going to be disabled. So if you can get them to understand that, a lot of times that's an easier pill to swallow to remove trees. So what we're working on right now, one of our big projects is that currently we do all our ramp inspections on paper. And so we are in the process of adopting a digital inspection form. And so this form is going to be tied into our GIS system. And so whenever the inspectors complete their inspection, they'll automatically upload into our GIS system so that it doesn't have to go through another person or another system to do that secondary function of mapping. Next slide, please. So on Tpar side, things that we've done to make it better for pedestrians during construction. So back in 2016, actually prior to even the agreement with Creek, we adopted an ordinance that prioritized pets and bikes in work zones. And so prior to that, whenever we used to just have street closures, we just said, close the sidewalk, close the bike lane, and they'll figure out where to go. And so with the ordinance, every project that closes street or sidewalk has to take into consideration pets, bikes and peds. And so they would have to look at either closing parking lane or travel lane before they can consider moving it, before they can use the detour on like the other side of the street or going around to a different block or something. So we haven't done any surveys on it, but kind of anecdotally, we've got feedback that, that it is much better than it had been in the past. So I think we're heading in the right direction on that. Another thing that we did to help out with the Tpar is a compliance program. Prior to, again, 2016, we really didn't have a mechanism to deal with contractors who weren't following it. So now, in the first couple of years of the when we set up the compliance program, there was a lot of fines for people who weren't setting it up right or not getting permits at all. But in the last couple of years, the compliance has actually been pretty high. Every time we go out, is usually the contractor not setting up quite right. We talk to them, and the situation is corrected quickly. So I think that's another indication that Portland's on the right track. Another thing that we did back in 2016 is we updated the temporary traffic control manual. The manual incorporated the accommodations for pets and bikes. So in that, a standard drawing was developed for how to set up pedestrian detours or Tpars around city blocks. And ours is a little bit different than the Odot one. I think the Odot one's a little bit more broad and it deals with more high-speed roads. And so our traffic control manual deals with more of the situations that we face in the urban areas. One of the examples is, I think, on if you use the Odot manual, some of the signs are, you place the signs 300-400 feet upstream of the closure. Well, our blocks are only like 200 feet long. So if we did that, we're putting our signs so far in advance that it confuses the drivers. So we have things that are more in tune with what we do in Portland. Yeah, so that's pretty much what, kind of in a nutshell, what we do in Portland for ADA and Tpars.
Great, thank you very much, Jim. And next up, we have Derek Jensen with us from Lane County. Derek, if you could go ahead and unmute, and then we'll turn it over to you.
Hello, how's it going?
Great. Looks like you're muted. There you go.
All right. So in Lane County, we've inventoried about 1,600 ramps, and that need, a lot of them are already present or considered missing. So, and we have about 1,400 ramps that are failing, and about a third of those are just missing ramps where we need to add them in the future. We inventoried about 133 push buttons. 27 of them are passing, but pretty much all of them are failing because they're not audible. In 2019, we developed an ADA transition plan where our goal was to upgrade 44 ramps a year and 2 to 3 push buttons. And in 2019, we upgraded 104 ramps. And in 2020, we upgraded 74 ramps. And the average cost is about $8,600 per ramp. And we also got another 30 ramps from facility permits. Some of the challenges we have, we do all our own in-house designing on all of our ramps. And then we also have our own. So the blending of our grade systems into the existing drainage patterns is very difficult, because when you're retrofitting the ramps, a lot of times, your gutter flow is 0.5% or less. And so it's challenging to prevent ponding and debris built up in the mouth of the ramp. Another thing, so I work in inspections, and so important thing for me is in the plan review process, when I'm looking at these ramps, is I feel it's really important to visit the project site. That way you can come up with any unforeseen project costs that might not be in consideration. We have a lot of rural communities, and so there's certain things. For instance, we did a job in the town of Coburg, and on the corner where there was this church, they had a memorial bench, and it was a very prominent figure in the town of Coburg for years, in a family that's basically lived there for 4 generations. And so it wasn't part of the initial plan, but in talking to the contractor, we were able to kind of extend a little area landing where we mounted the bench. And when I was there kind of reviewing the plans and looking, I noticed how many people in the community were actually using this bench. And so I tried to identify situations like that to make the community happy about what we're doing. Another thing is, in these towns, a lot of things that get overlooked is irrigation systems. A lot of times we don't have bid items in our projects for irrigation. And a lot of times when you're excavating a ramp, a lot of the times your irrigation is basically right up against the concrete. You got to excavate that little bit to make room for forms. And so we end up replacing a lot of irrigation that wasn't included originally. And so that's something I look out for now. And then on these retrofits, I would say the majority of the time, the whole thing gets lowered, because a lot of time it's our ramp runs that are too steep. And so we got to get everything brought down, which causes erosion problems, which we end up adding a lot of retaining curbs and such that weren't factored in the initial estimate. And so those are things that I'm out looking for. And then also, you know, on the retrofits, I noticed on a slide earlier, when you're coming into a driveway, they recommend a 5-foot kind of transition to come down. Well, a lot of times, you know, we have maybe 2 foot or less, you know, of a transition before our ramp run, which makes it very difficult to match those in and maintain, you know, the 7.5% running slope we're looking for in the design process. And, you know, it can get a little steep and be very difficult to construct. And then slight variations with the retrofits. I mean, I like to be very active with the contractors in the field, be upfront with them. I like to share, you know, the inspection forms we use, so they know what to expect when I'm actually going to inspect the ramp, so they know what to check when they're finishing to make sure that they're going to comply. There's a lot of fixed structures that can't be adjusted, you know, like traffic light poles and things. So when we lower the facility, now we're incorporating a tripping hazard, you know, on the existing structure. So we have to figure out how to best transition the flat work to eliminate that. And then kind of the challenges, you know, I think a very constructive pre-pour meeting, you know, when you're doing these in the field is very important. That way, you know, you can let the contractor know up front what you're expecting, how things are going to go, kind of how to proceed if we run into any problems. Sometimes, you know, designs just don't quite work out the way we think they're going to, and the contractor will be like, oh, this isn't quite working. And so I always recommend to not pour the ramp in that situation. You know, let's step back, let's figure out something we can do to make it compliant before we pour. You know, another thing is I really like to build a really good relationship with contractors. You know, I think that's something that's really important. You know, here in Lane County, we're used to dealing with similar, like the same contractors over and over and over again. So it's nice to build that trust to where they know exactly what to expect from us. They know we're going to be fair. You know, and I think that it helps drive costs down in the bidding process because, you know, contractors are wanting to get these jobs with the county because they know that, you know, we're a good partner in building the projects, you know, and I think a lot of our projects, you know, we tend to sometimes get a little bit cheaper prices than other people in the area. And I think a lot of that is because of relationships that have been built. And something to think about with the Tpar, I mean, for us, most of the time, we have existing facilities where we're able just to kind of close sidewalks, detour them, you know, a block down the road, say, hey, it's closed ahead. A lot of this stuff gets messed with overnight, you know, so it's important to constantly inspect them, make sure, you know, that they're functioning well the next day. Because we end up with signs getting stolen, thrown off the sidewalk, you know, just stuff messed with throughout the contract. And that's about all I have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Derek. And also to our other two local agency speakers, Joel Howie and Chun Wong. That provided some really great practical examples of how it is applying these standards out in the field.
I have one more thing to add really quickly. I'm sorry, I forgot something. So another thing is traffic signal boxes, which has been a major thing for us, is when I'm out, I like to pop the lids because so many of our retrofits get lowered that we don't think of, hey, we got to get this box down, but now we got to shorten the pipes, you know, because you have to have the minimum clearance. And so at that time it becomes a major adjust, and it's just something that we need to think about. And then also make sure that in our plan for the removal of asphalt to match the new flow, that we're not saw cutting through traffic loops that weren't accounted for.
Great advice. Thanks for adding that, Derek. That's an important point. All right, now we have about 15 minutes. We're right on schedule. And this is your opportunity to ask our speakers, all of the speakers that we've had this morning, your burning questions. So please raise your hand or put your question in chat. I'm going to stop the share. And all of us that are working on this, facilitating the session, will watch for your questions. So be sure to call them out or put them in chat. So we have one, what's the curb exposure between the ramps in the photo? Is that, did we already address that one?
No, Jeannie, that one came up during the PBOT presentation, and it was the first slide of PBOT's presentation.
Okay.
And so that's the photo that is disregarding.
Okay, well, I can answer that. So our PBOT standard is that we have 2 ramps at a corner. The curb exposure is 3 inches. And the reason for that is what we normally do, because of the lack of right-of-way, we can't build a long, a deep ramp. We can't, our ramps usually are only about 4 feet deep. And so what we do is we drop the top landing down 3 inches from the normal height of the sidewalks. So there's only 3 inches, usually from that top landing to the bottom landing. And so that keeps the curb and the landing at about the same height. That kind of prevents also that kind of that roller coaster across from one ramp to the other if you're walking that way.
Okay, good, thank you. Other questions? Just wave your hand or put your question in chat or unmute yourself.
There is a, oh wait, that's a direct message. They're asking about how do we acquire the ADA inspection certification document after the class is over? It's a general question. And I'm not sure on the answer on that.
This for the class, I presume. I believe you will be getting notification from our one of our support staff from the construction office, but I honestly don't have the specifics about that, but they keep track, as well as there is a link when you're certified that I had mentioned on the Engineering for Accessibility page. You can check to see if you're been added to that. So Art Nunez and Sarah Terry would probably be the people on the construction side for the certification, if you're interested in checking your results.
Thank you, Chandra.
Other questions? I'm scanning all of these various little tiles here to see if anybody's waving their hands. I'm not seeing anything.
There was a question to me about posting the PowerPoint. Maybe you want to reiterate where that was going to be.
Yeah, it looks also like maybe Jay Scanlon might be raising his hand in his video. You can unmute yourself and ask a question.
Yes, I'm working on a ramp system on Odot frontage. And I don't think the 2-foot gutter pan is an item or a row in the current ADA ramp checklist. I was wondering if that 2-foot gutter pan is going to be added to the design exception checklist.
Maybe provide me a little more clarity of where you think the gap is, because we captured that with the counter slope. Is there something else that you're thinking is being missed?
Well, I have a project where I was proposing a counter slope without a gutter pan of 3.6%. But my reviewer came back and said that it would require a design exception if I did not use the 2-foot concrete gutter pan.
Oh, for the Odot standard requirement at our curb ramps?
Yes.
Yeah, that's shown on the standard drawings. That came up. I don't have an answer right now, whether or not that will be on the checklist or if that will be something documented in the highway design manual.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're going to be able to accommodate it, but it's tricky because we have a 4.5-foot wide bike lane immediately in front of the curb.
Right.
So the 2-foot gutter pan would introduce a longitudinal seam for the bicyclists, and we're trying to avoid that.
Yeah, we've had a couple where they've expanded the curb and gutter to maybe incorporate the whole shoulder, or if there's a concrete bus loading pad and something, just make it all the way to that edge of travel in lieu of just the 2-foot.
Yeah, I think that's where we're going to go, but I think we'll probably have to introduce a keyway between the curb and sidewalk to make it constructible.
Yeah, you'll want to detail that out for your particular curb ramp. Right?
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
Thank you. And Chun has his hand up.
I think they might have answered it, but it really has to do with when you're on a roadway, such as Southeast Pile through Portland, where you have a travel lane adjacent to the curb line, and you're trying to put in that 2-foot gutter pan. I mean, like I think Jim was talking about, you have your wheel path over the joint there. So I guess is that addressed in when ODOT's designing roadways? Is that one of the things the designers were looking at, that that's where that seam is? And also, like Jim said, in a bike lane, they too can end up in the wheel path of a bike lane if you've got that 2-foot gutter pan. So is that something that they look out for when they design, or is that not one of their checklist items?
Yeah, it's not specifically a checklist item. The attributes on there are things that we record and document for the curb ramp and settlement. But those are design issues and feedback that I think we need to give, particularly younger designers that may not be thinking about some of the constructability and impacts on the other infrastructure.
Thanks, Chandra. I want to point out that Hannah put the link in the chat to where we're going to be posting the slides from today's session. There's lots of links in those slides and also the email contact information for all of the speakers. So be sure to take note of the location there where we're going to post the slides. And we'll do it pretty quickly. We just got to do the shuffle of trying to get the big, massive mega billion bytes of slides from my computer over to Hannah. So we'll figure that out. Other questions? Okay.
I'd like to give a shout out to Justin for on the Tpar and the mention of the use of caution tape. I have to say that is one of the biggest challenges that we have in Portland. Is almost every contractor I come across thinks that that is okay, and try to explain to them that by the time a blind pedestrian hits that tape, they're in the hole. We actually, in our Tpar training for that we give through our other staff, we have a video of a blind pedestrian walking down the sidewalk, and there is an open vault lid, and the pedestrian hits that vault lid and falls like 6 to 7 feet down into it. So we try to emphasize to people that blind people can't see those things. It's not, when you set up Tpars, it's not just for sighted people. It's also for blind. I mean, it's even more so for them than sighted.
Great point. Any other questions, comments? Seeing if anyone has their hand up.
Jeannie and Charlene, I do want to let folks know that if any of the folks that participated today, they have peers that mentioned that they weren't able to get into the meeting. We did have 100 people cap at the beginning of the meeting that we didn't know that we had when we started the event, and we know that we had over 100 people that registered. So the recordings of the session as well as the materials are going to all be available on the website, the link that Hannah provided. So if you're talking with peers and say, man, I wasn't able to get into the session, let them know that we are going to have materials posted. I think probably Hannah will work on getting some sort of announcement out to folks that registered. It's difficult for us to tell who was able to make it in or not, because people were kind of dropping in and coming back in and out of the meeting. But just, if you're working with a peer who missed their opportunity to get in under that 100 person at the beginning, we know some people might have given up by the time the limit was adjusted at our break. So just please share that with your peers.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? All right, we have 2 more things we'd like to do before we sign off here. First, we'd like to do an evaluation poll. This is simple, 2 questions.
I'd just like to thank everyone again for joining us today, and a particular thank you again to our speakers and to our local agency panelists. We do really appreciate you providing the time to do this training. I know that everyone who attended hopefully appreciated it, and as Tiffany mentioned, we'll get this recording up as quickly as we can and disseminate that information to you all, so you know where the link is if you want to come back and review it, or if you know someone wasn't able to get into the session today.
Jordan, would you like to say a few words?
I think Hannah just did a great job. Took the words out of my mouth. And I want to say thank you, Charlene and Jeannie, for for doing such a great job on keeping us on time and keeping the slides rolling and keeping us focused. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Tiffany, any final thoughts from you?
No, thanks everyone. Thanks to Hannah and Jordan and Jeannie for all the, and Charlene for all the coordination, and for our guest speakers. I know that it takes a lot of effort to put together the slides and the materials and to pull together the thoughts. So we really do appreciate that everybody took time out of their busy work schedules to prepare, and then also took time to be here and present information. So thanks everyone. And thanks for all of our attendees who showed up today. Good turnout.
And I'd like to give a shout out to Danielle Malone from Lynn County, who was our prior training subcommittee lead, who identified this topic, and obviously it was a popular one. So thanks to you, Danielle. And also thanks to our folks from Idaho for joining us. So we're training across state lines now. All right, thanks everyone. I'll ask Hannah, Jordan, and Charlene to stay on so that we can work out the logistics of